Welcome to Trending Faith here on GCU TV. My name is Ashley Romantic, and let's get started with today's question. What is the point of communion? Jason, please explain.
Well, communion, or what sometimes is called the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, was instituted by Christ. It's a practice that was instituted by Christ. Sometimes we refer to it as a sacrament. Some traditions refer to it as an ordinance or a rite, what have you. But essentially, Christ instituted two things that are very focused on the gospel that the church has the church more generally has there's been a consensus that those two are absolutely critical since the time of the Reformation. Now, if we go into other traditions prior to the Reformation, the Catholic tradition and so forth, the idea of sacraments broadens. There are more, but just to sort of stay focused on two within the Protestant line of thought, communion and the Lord's communion and baptism are absolutely critical. So if you think back to the institution of the Lord's Supper, on the night before Christ was crucified, the disciples were with him. They were enjoying a meal together. He was preparing them. We see a long discussion in the book of John preparing them for what was to come. And so he at a particular point during the supper, he took the bread and he broke it and he passed it around and he says, "This is my body. It's broken for you." And he passes it around and each person is going to take that. And really, if you can imagine the picture, it's like a metaphor of his body, and they're taking that into themselves. They're being sustained by his sacrifice. He's offering himself that they might be sustained. He's being broken that they might not be. He's giving them life, but he's losing his. It's a beautiful picture. And then he shifts to the wine. He passes that around and he says, "Drink this. This is my blood." In the book of Luke, it very specifically says this is the seal. This is what seals the new covenant. The pouring out of the lifeblood, the giving of the lifeblood from the Old Testament days was the substituting. The sacrifice was offering his life, the sheep, the lamb. In this case, Christ himself giving his life. It was pouring out of his body. They would take it. So symbolically, they were taking those things into themselves. They were being sustained as food sustains us. They were being sustained by those things that Christ was offering, and they were to do that regularly in remembrance of what he was about to do. Now, you can imagine at the supper, they probably didn't quite grasp the significance of that. However, very soon they would see him with his body broken. They would see the blood come out. They would see everything that he was alluding to. And so he said, do this regularly. Do this in remembrance of me. Paul later on in 1 Corinthians would say, this is something we do together within the church, and we do it continually so that we remember. We remember together. We proclaim together. We show in this acted ceremony, we show the death and the resurrection of Christ. We proclaim that amongst ourselves until he comes. That's a way of saying the gospel message, this reality of what Christ has accomplished, was not just something that we needed at the beginning, but it's what continues to sustain us. Just like food sustains us in this day, from day to day to day, we still need to speak that gospel to one another, to remember the grace of God, to rest in what Christ alone can accomplish, and to enjoy the blessing of God through that. It's a beautiful picture. We proclaim the Word of God. This is what the Reformers would say, that when you're looking for the true church, you're going to be looking for the Word preached rightly, but also the right administration of the sacraments. The pure preaching of the Word and the right administration of the sacraments. On the one hand, you have a verbal expression of the gospel. On the other, you have an acted out visual participation in this. And so we have both, and both of those are significant in the life of the church.
You know, you touched upon something I've often thought about when I'm experiencing communion, when I'm partaking in the juice and the bread, that it's often framed around remembering. Mm-hmm. It's a time to reflect deeply on our relationship with Christ and what those two elements mean. And yet, in the Corinthian passage, Paul reminds them that this shows forth the death of Christ. Mm-hmm. And we don't seem to highlight on that very much. And you touched upon it. I think it's a really important part of that experience together, that it's not just a personal, private reflection moment only,
right,
but at the same time we're reminding each other that Jesus gave his life and shed his blood to purchase our salvation. So yeah, it is a beautiful picture and a very intimate experience, but it can also be a proclamation moment too for for God's people. So it's a very special, unique thing to experience in the community of believers. And I've often thought while I'm sitting in the pew, or in certain settings where you stand and partake together, that for 2,000 years God's people have been doing this, in caves and in forests and in church buildings and homes and places of business where they have had that moment of reflection, that moment of proclamation in that way. It's just a really meaningful part of the Christian experience.
Well, I hope that answers your question, and as always, if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to send it to us at trendingfaith@gcu.edu or use the hashtag trendingfaith.